My name is Emily Carter. I am 31 years old. As I sat by the window on the morning flight from Boston, I looked out at the clouds and thought about the life I had left behind for the past 12 years. The sky behind the glass, alternating between gray and blue, mirrored the contradictions inside me. Not being in the same city as my family had always been good for me. Distance was not only geographical, it was also an emotional line of protection. Being far away makes it easier to control resentment. It hurts less to hurt people you don't see. The farther away you are from them, the less what they say echoes in your mind. But this time, the return was different. This was not a visit, not a holiday, not a birthday. This was the silent closing of an old score. Perhaps not with a goodbye, but with the acceptance of a truth. I had my laptop bag on my lap, but it wasn't file presentations or investor emails that were swirling in my mind. In the front pocket of my carry-on luggage was a letter signed with the prestigious seal of Harvard Business School. 3 months earlier, my startup, Quantalize AI, had received a major investment for its AI-based diagnostic systems in the healthcare sector. It sounds complicated, but at its core, what we were doing was saving lives. And we were doing it with technology. And I had built this success from scratch, without a partner or a supportive family. No financial support, no moral support. They saw my foray into entrepreneurship as a searching period. But this was the moment I found who I was. My mother's voice was still clear in my mind. Emily, if you want to study art, do it as a hobby. Real people go into business. The first time I heard that sentence, my heart froze. From that day on, no matter what I decided to do, I was labeled with a lack of seriousness in their eyes. And my father? His silence was always heavier. What he didn't say hurt me more than what he said, but sometimes he would speak out. Not wanting to take over the company is like betraying your family, he once said. We didn't give you these opportunities so you could put them in your backpack. For years, they belittled my own decisions. To them, walking my own path was another step towards failure. I chose to walk on a dirt road, on stones that had never been trodden before, a path that belonged to no one, a path that no one had planned. And that path was now bringing me back to the door of that house. When the plane landed, my feet did not tremble. On the contrary, every time my heels hit the ground, I felt a deep confidence. I felt calm and like the protagonist of a story in which I was in complete control. This time I was returning to my parents not just as their daughter, but as a CEO who had built her life with her own hands. But I wasn't going to show it right away. Some victories are quiet. Sometimes the most impressive moment is just standing there without saying anything. A look, a demeanor, a posture. It can even override words. My phone vibrated as I picked up my luggage. On the screen was a short but familiar message from my mother. Don't forget the family dinner tomorrow. Your brother Thomas is celebrating his new position as manager. Please don't be late this time. I hesitated for a moment. It wasn't the words in the message that struck me, but the tone behind it. Thomas again, his success again. And again I was only expected to be there on time. No, how are you? No, it will be good to see you. Just a mission. But I smiled. This time, it was different. Tomorrow we will celebrate not only Thomas's promotion, but also who I am. Of course, they don't know that yet, but they will, and once they do, they'll never forget. It was after 5 in the afternoon when I arrived at my parents' house. As the daylight slowly gave way to an orange evening, the headlights of my car swept the old stone sidewalk. I pulled over to the side of the road, stood behind the wheel for a few seconds, and looked out the window at the mailbox, its faded blue paint peeling, our last names still intact. The Carter family. The letters on the sign seemed to have rusted over time. Some had fallen off. But it was there, as if it had been waiting for me for years, as if it hadn't moved until I returned. When I stood in front of the door, there was a strange mixture on my face, familiarity and strangeness. I had grown up in this house, but now, standing in front of it, I was a different person. The house had remained the same. I might still be the same Emily on the outside, but the world I had built on the inside would never fit the rules of this house. My mother answered the door. She was wearing a light beige blouse and a freshly ironed skirt. On her feet, she looked like a catalog page with her thin slippers clicking softly on her heels. Her hair in a tight bun, the usual small pearl earrings in her earlobes, a silhouette that hadn't changed for years. She looked me up and down. Her gaze traveled first to my face, then to my hair, then to my shoes. There was no criticism in his eyes, but no warmth either. He put on his classic half-smile. "Emily," he said politely, his voice uncharacteristically controlled. "I'm glad you came. Come in. Don't forget to take off your shoes." Once inside, I took a deep breath for a moment. The smell of the house was still the same. A mixture of mild fabric softener, old books, and freshly baked cake. I smelled a smell of life that was familiar but no longer mine. It was as if I was entering a museum, not a home. The walls of the living room were still covered with awards my father had received, plaques such as Manager of the Year, Regional Sales Champion, Corporate Loyalty Honor, were lined up in gold frames. That corner was like the sacred showcase of the house. On the opposite wall, Thomas's Harvard diploma was neatly hung. It looked as if a spotlight had been shown on it, frames from the family album, photographs from his graduation ceremony. Even his pencil drawings from when he was young were framed. Everything was for her. A map of her success was drawn in the hall. And what about mine? My master's certificate I sent years ago? The Innovation Award for Women Entrepreneurs? The clipping from the day I received my first investment? None of it was there. Not on the wall, not on the coffee table. Maybe it was in a drawer. Maybe it was in an email attachment that was never opened, or straight into the trash. Just then, my father's voice came. Without looking up from his armchair in the living room, staring at the TV, he muttered, "Look who's here, the big investor." There was no praise in his voice. He was always like that. He neither congratulated nor praised. His love language was silence. Silent expectation. Silent judgment. I smiled, because those sentences didn't hurt anymore. "Hello, Dad. How is your back pain?" "It still hurts," he said with a short sigh. "But I'll retire when Thomas takes over the company soon." He locked eyes with Thomas as he said this. My brother, who stepped into the living room at that moment, was smiling as always. His suit jacket was ironed, his shoes polished. There was a goal-oriented clarity in his eyes. Thomas. He was always the model son, disciplined, ambitious, loyal to the family plan. He did whatever they asked. He nodded when Dad told him to, followed Mom's advice when she gave it. He succeeded without breaking the rules, and that's why he was always the golden boy of the house. "Emily," he said, giving me a hug, "it's good to see you." I smiled and hugged her. "It's good to see you too." He wasn't going to be at dinner that night. He was busy, but my mom was preparing something for him at home. I went upstairs and left my suitcase, each step creaking like a memory as I climbed the stairs. When I entered my room, my breath caught slightly. This place. It was as if time had frozen. Posters from high school on the walls, a yellowed literary magazine on my desk, my childhood drawings tucked under a lace cover in the bookcase, and in the corner, an unopened box. A graduation present. It still had that inscription on it, "To a future worthy of your achievements." But the bands hadn't been opened. It was as if it had never existed. I held it in my hands. It was light. It was probably a simple set of pens or a frame, but it wasn't what was inside that was valuable. It was the way it was given. And that giving had never happened. After putting my things away, I took a deep breath and looked in the mirror. The Emily who left here years ago was broken. The Emily of today was strong, but that resentment wasn't completely erased. It had only built on it. I went downstairs. In the kitchen, my mother was still cooking. The steam from the pot fogged the kitchen window slightly. On the counter were recipe notes for Thomas's favorite dishes. "Tomorrow is a special night for Thomas," she said without turning around. "Wear something fancy, okay? And please don't talk business. It's his day." "Sure," I said shortly. But inside me there was a whirlwind of thoughts. On the surface, I looked like a calm lake, but deep down, huge waves were already forming. Because in fact, tomorrow won't just be his day. Tomorrow, everything will change. Thomas was always the showcase child, the one who stood at the front of family albums, the one who was proudly shown to guests, the one who was asked to speak first at holiday meals. Things would take shape around him. Tones would change at the mention of his name. My family invested in him, spending time, money, patience, and lots of praise. They never hesitated to claim his achievements as their own. I was always the other, the one they would say, "Our daughter also chose a different path," and move on to the next topic without listening to half of what I had to say. The sentences directed at me were always familiar. "You're too emotional, Emily. It would be nice if you were more realistic. It's nice to dream, but that's not how life works." But I had not only dreamed, I had acted, and I had taken what I had built from scratch to the top. But in their eyes, I was never someone who pursued a real career, because my path did not intersect with theirs. For them, a career was a tie, a corporate business card, a company car. For me, it was waking up at 3 a.m. for an idea, taking risks, being rejected and still not giving up. I was never in the shop window because I chose to break that shop window and look out through the glass. When I went down to the kitchen the next morning, the coffee machine had, as usual, beaten my father to it. It was running quietly, the smell of the coffee dripping, slowly wafted throughout the kitchen. I took my cup and sat on a chair while my father sat at the end of the table, reading the newspaper with his glasses lowered to the tip of his nose. It was the same routine every morning. The financial page would be opened, the developments in the sector would be read, and only the headlines would be mumbled without comment. It was as if he were a stock market analyst, but he was watching Thomas's rise, not the market. "We're leaving early today," he said, not taking his eyes off the newspaper. "Thomas has a presentation. The CEO will be there, our son's milestone." The word "our sons" caught in my throat like a knot. It was their son, yes. Always has been. I'm just Emily, their daughter, the family member who is treated like a guest but whose photo is not on the wall. I sipped my cup. I answered without making eye contact. "I'll stop by the company too." My father slowly lowered the newspaper. "Really?" "Yes," I said. "I have a meeting with a client." My voice was neither excited nor eager to explain. It was quite ordinary. But the word "client" in the sentence must have pricked my mother's ears. My mother, who entered the kitchen at that moment, raised her eyebrows and asked, "You said you weren't bringing work here, Emily." A slight tension settled in our gaze, as always. "The appointment was prearranged," I said. It wasn't a lie. I was just hiding an important part of the truth, because that morning I had breakfast not with a client, but with the top person in the company, Helen Brooks, the CEO. Helen was the CEO of the company where Thomas worked, and 3 weeks earlier, a memorandum of understanding had been signed between Quantalize AI and her company. But the Carter family didn't know that yet. The excitement that morning was of a different kind. It wasn't the anxiety of a presentation or the stress of a job interview. It was the quiet, controlled, well-earned power that comes after years of scorn. The place chosen for breakfast was a small restaurant in a simple but prestigious hotel near the center of Boston. I got to the table early, my brown leather portfolio in front of me. Inside were the reports of the last investment round, the current growth graphs of my company, sample outputs of our artificial intelligence modules used in hospitals. Each of them was a reason for pride in their own right, but they were just tools for me that morning, because it wasn't about showing success. It was about talking about that success. Helen arrived on time. She approached the table in a black blazer, an elegant scarf, and with direct attention in her eyes. She shook my hand. "Emily," she said, "your resume and your company are impressive. I mean, this may sound strange to hear, but I was surprised to learn about your family connections." "More like distance than connections," I said, smiling. Helen laughed. "Brilliant. I'd like to invite you to the meeting today. People should get to know you outside the formalities. You are the new face of this business." "I'll be there," I said in a clear voice. I finished my coffee, we shook hands, and left. As we walked to the car, the sky cleared. The air was cool but bright. My phone vibrated as I placed my portfolio on the seat. There was a message from Thomas on the screen. "If you are at the company today, my mom is expecting you at noon. Don't wear anything extravagant. It's formal presentation day." I paused for a moment, then laughed. Ah, Thomas. In his world, success was still measured by the neatness of the tie and the smoothness of the slide transitions. As he prepared a PowerPoint in front of his boss, clutching his note cards tightly, I was having breakfast with that boss and strategizing. And perhaps the most ironic thing was this: nobody knew yet. But they would find out very soon. As I approached the company building, my eyes caught the sky reflected in its gray windows. This building once seemed to me only a gateway to Thomas's future. For years, success for my family meant passing through this building. The day Thomas started working here, my mother could hardly hold back her tears. "Our son is now in the real world," my father said proudly. That day, I sipped my coffee at my freelance computer in the cafe across the street and just looked at this building from a distance. Back then, I didn't belong to any of the layers inside this building. But today was different. Today, I was at the heart of that building, and not in the corner of an office, but in the center of the meeting table. As I approached the entrance to the building, my steps were clear. Neither the heel of my shoe was hesitantly striking the floor, nor was there a tremor in me. There was a strange silence inside me, the silence of powerful people. I told the guard at the entrance my name, and he looked up at me. He must have thought I was an ordinary visitor. He turned back to his computer screen, and in a few seconds his gaze changed. His pupils dilated, his voice a little softer. "Emily Carter, CEO of Quantalize. Yes, your name is here. Please, you will be directed to the conference room." Only one sentence passed through me. This is it. I was no longer in the shadow of the name Carter, but in the power of the name Emily. I had built my own name, brick by brick, with the mortar of rejection, the concrete of loneliness, and the cement of perseverance. When I got into the elevator, I looked at my face reflected in the mirrored door. My outfit was simple but elegant: a smoked blazer, black shoes with stiletto heels, a metallic gray watch on my left wrist. My makeup is natural, my hair in a tight ponytail, everything as it should be. But in fact, this image was just a shell. My real power was in what I had to say, the idea I represented, and the way I got there. My phone rang. It was my mom. I looked at the screen, kept my finger steady on the screen, but I didn't answer. Nothing today should have interrupted this moment. Not my mother's expectations, not my father's passive comments, not the shadows of the past. Today, it was just me. As I exited the elevator, I was directed to a large meeting room at the end of the corridor. Inside this room, surrounded by glass panels, preparations for the presentation had begun. As soon as I stepped inside, Thomas was the first person I saw. Company badge on his lapel, note cards in his hand. He was in the classic pre-presentation rush. His eyes were memorizing sentences. His fingers were nervously smoothing the edges of the cards. I took a deep breath and slowly guided my steps into the room, my heels not echoing on the carpeted floor, but my presence weighing down the room. When Thomas noticed me, his gaze froze. He paused with the cards in his hand. His eyes focused on me. It was as if his mind was suddenly overloaded with too much data. He tried to smile. An unsuccessful smile settled on his face. "What are you doing here?" he said, almost in a whisper. I looked directly at him. "I'm invited," I said. My tone was clear, but with an inner calm. "The CEO and I just got out of breakfast. We needed to discuss a few partnership details." His eyes widened at the end of the sentence. Time stopped for a second. From the look on her face, I knew she understood what that sentence meant. I was no longer just his sister Emily, but a reality that had infiltrated his professional world. And not as a guest, but as an official. Inside the hall, the technical team was making final preparations. Microphone tests were going on while the company logo rotated on the screen. Thomas sat down in a chair. He could no longer even look at the empty seats opposite him. A few minutes later, executives from the company, representatives from the investment department, technology consultants, and a few outside investors started to enter. The air in the hall grew heavy. Presentation time was approaching. And then, CEO Helen Brooks walked in. Step by step, she made her way through the crowd. Without even looking at Thomas, she headed straight for me. She greeted me with a firm but gentle handshake. "If you're ready, let's start with you," she said in a clear voice. There were whispers in the hall. Some eyes turned to Thomas, others to me. At that moment, the focus of the room changed. Until that moment, it had been Thomas's day, but now it wasn't. The presentation screen flashed. The Quantalize AI logo slowly reflected on the screen. The title Strategic Partnerships appeared in the corner with a small animation. I stood up from my seat. I didn't have any note cards, because I had not memorized what I was going to tell. I had lived them. I returned to the hall, and all eyes were locked on me. "Good morning," I said. "I'm Emily Carter. Today I'm going to tell you about a journey, not just an investment proposal." I turned my eyes to Helen, then back to the crowd. This is the story of one woman believing in her vision, taking every no for an answer, and ultimately rebuilding not only her company, but her identity. Thomas, sitting in a chair in the corner, stared at me, unmoving. At this moment, he too was now a spectator of my story. Today I'm going to tell you about a journey, not just an investment proposal. After he said that sentence, the air in the room changed. It was as if someone had closed one unseen door and opened another. There was no longer a presentation. A showdown was beginning. But this reckoning would not be done with shouting, but with statistics, vision, and dignity. On the projection, just below the Quantalize AI logo, the future of artificial intelligence in health was written in large letters. The color palette was simple, navy blue, gray, and white. But the content, the power of the content, was striking. Everyone in the room was paying attention. With the slide transitions, a different rhythm settled in the room. Not only my words were speaking, but also the numbers, real data, real results. And behind him, there were no surname privileges, no family connections. It was just me. In the last 3 years, Quantalize has achieved an 87% success rate in making correct diagnoses with artificial intelligence-supported analysis systems in the health sector, I said. I pointed to the graph with the laser pointer in my hand. This is not just a statistic. This is about intervening in thousands of people's lives in a timely manner, reducing unnecessary treatment, and supporting doctors in their conscientious decision-making. Several people in the room nodded. I noticed CEO Helen Brooks nodding with a slight smile. We made eye contact. At that moment, I sensed that she was thinking, "We are working with the right people." But what really caught my attention was the silent opening of the back door of the hall. The person who walked in was my father. He was clutching his calendar agenda tightly and looking around with his usual distant expression. At first he seemed to have difficulty finding a seat. Then he quietly took the empty chair in the back row. Our gazes met. As I continued my speech, my father's gaze seemed to freeze. The man who for years had told me, "Don't be a dreamer, get a real job," was now listening to his daughter, whom he called a dreamer, as a corporate partner. My words became stronger. My tone of voice became clearer. My body stood tall. "This technology is not only creating efficiencies," I said, "it's revolutionizing ethical decision-making in healthcare. Because we are integrating not only speed, but also conscience into our algorithms." With that sentence, a case study popped up on the slide. A hospital example. Real-time results of the module we developed for early diagnosis of cancer. The slide animation was striking, but kept simple. It showed numbers, graphs, and most importantly, before and after. The technical team in the room was taking notes. Someone from the investment department leaned his head forward and whispered something to his friend next to him. The presentation had now made an impact. It was not just a briefing, it was the transfer of a vision. When I finished the presentation, the last slide on the screen said only this: "Saving lives is too big a task to be left to doctors alone." Then there was a short silence in the hall, and then applause. It wasn't the kind of applause that shook the hall, but it was sincere, clear, and respectful. There was surprise in this applause. There was acceptance, and maybe a little admiration. CEO Helen stood up. She took the floor. She spoke slowly. "Emily's vision will not only be an opportunity for us, but also a compass that will shape the future of our company. We are delighted to welcome her here." It was short but clear, and it was like a seal of approval in front of everyone in the room. When the presentation was over, Thomas still hadn't left his seat. His eyes were on the screen, but his attention was elsewhere. The dullness on his face made him unrecognizable. Until that moment, he thought all the spotlight would be on him. But the stage had already turned, and now there was only one light: me. As I was packing my things, the crowd slowly started to disperse. Some executives handed me business cards. Others approached me and asked questions. "What data sets do you work with? What is your company's software architecture based on? Do you have a scaling plan for future partnerships?" I gave clear answers to the questions. I explained each of them patiently and confidently, because I was not just a promoter in that hall. I was the architect of that system. As I was about to leave the hall, my father stood up. He took a step closer. He spoke in a tone I hadn't heard in years, soft, introspective, almost fragile. "Emily," he said. Just my name. There was nothing else in those words. But there was so much in his tone. I stopped. We locked eyes. "Can I see you?" he said quietly. In that moment, years of frozen time seemed to thaw for a second. But my answer was clear. I bowed my head slightly. "Sure, Dad," I said. Then I paused for a moment and smiled. "But first, I have a few other meetings." In that moment, I didn't just make sentences. I was no longer managing my time. My time was determined by what was waiting for me. After the meeting, I had one-on-one meetings with several executives who were waiting for me. All of them were impressed by the presentation. Each of them was questioning the potential of Quantalize's system from a different angle and lining up to make cooperation offers. This analysis algorithm will both speed up our operations and strengthen our ethical responsibility, one executive said, taking notes. When another excitedly asked, "Is it really artificial intelligence with conscience integrated?" my answer was clear. Data alone is not human. It is how it is read that makes it human. But despite this intense pace, my mind was focused on another door, my father's office. For years, I had always felt excluded from that room. That office was a symbol not only of company matters, but also of the hierarchy within the family. You couldn't enter without permission, and even if you were allowed, it was to receive instructions, not to bring ideas. But today I was called there, not as an employee or a child, but as an equal, perhaps for the first time. As I walked through the quiet corridors of the executive floor, I noticed the plaques hanging on the walls. Awards the company had won over the years, certificates of achievement, corporate commendations. Each one had been used as a backdrop for Thomas's presentations. I stopped in front of my father's room. The door was open. The light was dim. I looked softly into the room. My father was looking out the window, his hands in his pockets, his back to me. "May I come in?" I said, softening my voice. "Sure," he said without turning. "I was waiting for you anyway." My steps were quiet, but the voices inside me were loud. As I entered the room, it was as if I walked with the shadows of my childhood. The air in the room was still familiar, the smell of tobacco and old notebooks, prizes lined up on the shelves, a vintage calendar on the table, family photos. But there was one thing I noticed. I wasn't in any of the photos. Thomas smiling next to his father at his elementary school graduation, Mom and Dad shaking hands at a business meeting, Thomas in a frame from his first year at Harvard. But me? I was absent. That absence was more of a decided erasure than a physical one. My absence in those photographs was a choice, not an amnesia. My father finally turned to me. His gaze was very different from the man in the chair he had sat in at the company this morning. There was a manager sitting there, and here, a father stared at his daughter, not knowing what to do. "Emily," he said slowly, "when I watched the presentation just now, I didn't recognize you." The confession was more open and vulnerable than I had expected. His voice was hoarse, his eyelids drooped a little, his shoulders slumped slightly. More than a man who had lost his strength, he was a father carrying the weight of the past on his back. "Because you didn't recognize me," I said in a calm but full voice. "For years you watched not who I was, but who you wanted me to be. When I didn't fit your mold, the me in your eyes faded away." My words didn't echo around the room, because there was no need for an echo. Everything that needed to be heard was already echoing in the past between us. My father bowed his head. He walked to his desk but did not sit down. He leaned against the edge of the table. His fingers were interlocked. "Maybe you're right," he said with difficulty, "but I'll be honest. I didn't expect this. The CEO is talking about you standing up. The team leaders are excited to hear your name. You've really accomplished something." A strange feeling came over me. Years ago, that sentence would have made me cry. Today, I just bowed my head slightly, because that sentence was no longer a recognition of a goal, but of a fact. "I know," I said quietly. "To witness an achievement like yours, it's both proud and a little bit painful," he continued, "because there's a part of you that wishes we could have done it together." There was a moment of silence. Birds were singing outside. The Boston sky was out the window, slightly cloudy, but not dark. "Do you remember what you said when I left home that day?" I asked. "Your words are still clear in my mind. If you want to study art, do it as a hobby. You have no place in the real world." I wasn't sure if her eyes filled up, but his face changed. The line of defense dissolved. There was real regret there now. "Yes," he said. "You walked your own path. We couldn't see it. You were alone. You kept walking even when we turned our backs on you. The first bridge of years of distance was being built between us. It was not yet solid, but it was named. Then he looked into my eyes, like a father for the first time, not as a business partner or a wayward daughter, as a human being, as an adult, independent woman. "I want forgiveness," he said. "But first I want to know you, the real you, without the shadow of the past." Those words didn't work a miracle, but they gave birth to a reality, because forgiveness was not about forgetting. It starts with knowing. "Over time," I said, "step by step." "I'll be a proud father at dinner tomorrow," he said sincerely. "For real this time, without pretense." I turned away. I could feel him still looking after me thoughtfully as I walked to the door. Maybe there was a lot left to say, but silence was the right thing to say at that moment, because some conversations with the eyes. As I was getting ready for the family dinner, I opened my closet, but I didn't try to decide what to wear for a long time. Today, my appearance didn't need to be a means of proof. My navy blue, slightly oversized blazer and straight-cut trousers, together with my posture, already said enough. I used to spend hours getting ready for a family dinner. My hair, makeup, shoes, everything had to be perfect. Because to get approval, not only success was enough, but your appearance had to live up to expectations. But not anymore. It was clear who was who in this house, and I didn't have to wear fancy clothes to show it. When I went downstairs, the lights in the living room were dim, and the table was carefully set like in a fancy restaurant. A silver candelabra sat in the center of a long tablecloth, and crystal wine glasses refracted and reflected the light. My mother was sitting on the sofa. Her hair was carefully blow-dried as if she had just left the hairdresser. She had a classic, restrained smile on her face. She got up and approached me. "Welcome, Emily," she said softly. His voice was soft, no judgment this time. "It will be good to be together as a family tonight." "I hope so," I said, and smiled. There was no provocation in my smile, no distance. There was only truth. And this time, my mother felt it. For the first time in years, there was not silence between us, but acceptance. In the corner of the living room, Thomas was standing in his gray suit. He stood as straight as ever, but the expression on his face had changed. The unwavering confidence in his eyes had given way to uncertainty. It was as if, for the first time, he felt as if the family showcase was not his alone. She nodded slightly as I walked past her. "Emily," he said shortly. There was no sarcasm in his tone, no coldness, just a balanced realization. The old carpet in the living room, the bookcase my father had specially brought from Milan years ago, the antique clock. Everything was in its place. But within this familiar decor, relationships had changed. While a house remains the same, when the contents change, it becomes a different place. When we got to the dining table, there was a certain tension in the atmosphere. But this tension was not hostile. It was more of an anticipation. Not sure what is being celebrated. Eyes shifted from time to time. No one dared to utter the first sentence. My father came last. Usually he was always the earliest, but this time he came a little late, a little thoughtful. He was wearing a simple but elegant navy blue jacket I had never seen before. He paused briefly when he saw me, then nodded. Short, but clear. I realized at that moment that she no longer saw me only as my daughter, but as a person in front of her. When everyone was seated, my mother began from her place at the head of the table. "We are here today to celebrate Thomas's new position," she said. Her voice was controlled as always, but this time there was a faint tremor in it. Then he stopped. His gaze slowly shifted to me. We locked eyes. "But also," he said, "it's an evening when we realize that some successes come too late." When I heard this sentence, all the walls inside me shook for a moment. Such an acceptance from my mother's mouth. It was a moment I had dreamed of for years, but had never given it a chance. "Emily," she said, not taking her eyes off me. "For a long time we didn't understand your path. We even ignored it most of the time. But after the presentation I saw yesterday, I realized sometimes the most powerful work grows in silence." There was a deep silence at the table. It was as if everyone tried to digest that sentence for a few seconds. My mother's admission that what she called strong work had been growing outside the house for years. It was a revolution in this house. Just then, Thomas cleared his throat. He bowed his head, but then slowly straightened up. "The CEO praised you yesterday," he said. "Not just management, but even the technical team was talking about you. I have to admit, it hurt at first." He paused. I didn't expect such a statement from him. But he continued. "Then I thought about it. You did it all by yourself, from scratch, without any help, and I really appreciate it." Hearing that sentence from him had a much deeper impact than I expected, because this time there was respect in his voice, not jealousy. And Thomas's respect was a sign that the balance in the house had shifted forever. I looked into his eyes. It was real. It was genuine. "Thank you," I said shortly. "My path was not like yours, but that didn't mean it was wrong." At that moment, my father raised his glass, slowly but with determination. "Tonight," he said, "I raise a toast to my daughter, who is walking her own path." My mother, Thomas, even the serving assistant, raised their glasses at the same time. All eyes turned to me. For years, I had sat in the invisible chair in the family. This was the first time I had a real chair, and no one argued about it, because everyone had noticed. Slowly, I raised my glass. "Tonight, let's celebrate not only success, but also awareness," I said, and I drank. Everything was the same at the table that night, but the table was different. because in the center of that table there was no longer silence, but acceptance. After dinner, the crowd in the living room dispersed and the plates were quietly cleared away. Dad and Thomas were still chatting in the living room, but the conversation that evening was not centered around work, as we were used to, but more around the question, what did we miss? I went quietly into the kitchen, perhaps the part of the house where I felt the least judged. When I was a kid, I used to help my mom knead cookie dough here, and every time my hands would turn to flour, but she was always happy. Then, over time, that warmth disappeared. I sat on a chair while my mother washed the dishes at the counter, carefully placing the porcelain plates one by one with her hands. There was years of habit in her every movement. It was as if being careful was a way for her to keep control of her life. But tonight, something was different. His shoulders were lower, his face was more tired, yet soft. Suddenly he began to speak, not taking his eyes off the dishes. "I really meant what I said tonight," he said. "All these years we've been incomplete with you. We've always defined success through Thomas. Maybe we needed more time to see you." His voice did not crack, but there was a deep regret in it. His confession cracked the walls, even if it didn't erase all the mistakes of the past. I leaned my back against the chair and folded my hands in my lap. I wasn't hurt, but that didn't mean I had forgiven. Some wounds scab over but leave scars. "It wasn't that you didn't understand," I said slowly. "It hurt me that you didn't try to understand. It's like there was always only one truth, and I was ostracized for not following it." My mother put the last plate in the sink. Then she turned off the faucet and took a deep breath. Before he could dry his face, he turned to me. "Maybe if we tried to understand you," she said, her voice trembling this time, "you wouldn't have to go so far." That sentence hit me, because he was right. In those years, I had to leave not only physically but also emotionally. It was not my choice to go away. It was an obligation. At that moment, my mother opened the old drawer next to the counter. Her hands were shaking slightly as she opened the drawer. She took out a yellowed, slightly crumpled envelope. There was an old handwriting on the envelope, a familiar font, but one I hadn't seen in a long time. It said, "Emily, Harvard graduation." The envelope was old, but it had never been opened. It had never been sent. "I wrote this back then," he said, "but I couldn't bring myself to send it. Because I couldn't write sincerely at the time, but I kept it. I can give it to you today. Maybe it will be late, but—" He was silent. He averted his eyes. I looked at the envelope. Part of me wanted to take it. The other part of me whispered that I didn't need it, because I needed those little sentences of approval, those little words years ago. But I no longer owed my identity to that envelope. I didn't reach out my hand. I just nodded my head. "Thank you," I said politely. "I really do, but I don't need to take this anymore, because I can see in your face how you feel." Mom bowed her head. She smiled slightly. In that moment, a bond that should have happened years ago was quietly reestablished. It was not a kneeling apology. It was an acceptance. At that moment, Thomas entered the kitchen. In one hand, he held his still unfinished wine glass, in the other his phone. His eyes were tired but carried a different energy. "We'll go over the details of that presentation in the office tomorrow," he said. "You had a few suggestions. I really want to implement them." I turned toward him. I was struck by the clarity in his tone. "Are you sure?" I said, smiling slightly, because he always had his own way. I didn't think he would care about my opinion. "I'm sure," he said. "I'm sure when I look at you, because I've never been able to think like you, Emily. You're on another level. I memorize calendars. You navigate." Those words were powerful enough to shake off the weight of all the past rivalries between us. At that moment, for the first time, my brother and I felt like comrades, not rivals. Perhaps this was the beginning of becoming a real family. The kitchen was dimly lit, but our burdens were a little lighter. It was as if everyone saw each other for the first time in the house, in their true form, with their brokenness, their successes, their shortcomings. My steps were light as I returned to my room that night. I received a notification on my phone. I glanced at it out of the corner of my eye. It was an email. The sender, Helen Brooks. Subject, "Congratulations." Subject, "After your presentation, 2 more investors said they wanted to move forward with us. They said they have confidence not only in Quantilyze, but in you. I congratulate you. Helen." I hung up the phone, sat on my bed. I smiled. My family raised a glass to me that night, but the real congratulation was the silent acceptance of the journey I started alone years ago. And that congratulation was far beyond the words that the little girl inside me had been waiting for years ago. They might as well not applaud me anymore, because I had already given myself a standing ovation. When I opened my eyes the next morning, I looked at the familiar ceiling lines in the room. It was the same room where years ago I used to study until the morning before exams, silently pouring my tears onto my pillow. It hadn't changed. The wooden bookcase was still in the corner. Even the arrangement of the ceramic trinkets on it was the same. On one corner of the wall, in a faded colored frame, my high school graduation photo still hung. I was standing in the back row, a forced smile on my face, as if I was in a place where I didn't belong even at that moment. But this morning was different. Even though I woke up in the same bed, I was no longer that girl. As I threw off the blanket and stood up, there was a lightness in my body. Clarity replaced the heaviness. I was now at the center of a life of my own. The room was the same, the house was the same, but I was someone else. I didn't even think when I chose my clothes. I put on a straight-cut shirt with a white collar and black cloth pants. It was neither flashy nor pretentious. It was simple but powerful. I didn't wear makeup. My hair was pulled back tightly, and I thought of my mother's words years ago. "You have to look good in important places, Emily." But now the definition of important places had changed. I no longer needed to dress up to be important. I needed to produce. When I went downstairs, the morning light filtered through the kitchen window and hit the table. My father had already started breakfast. He was reading the morning reports as usual. As he sipped his coffee, he looked up, as was his habit. But this time, there was something else in that look. Our eyes met. He did not say good morning, nor did he make one of his classic agenda comments. He only bowed his head slightly. It was a seemingly insignificant gesture, but in our relationship, it was almost like an apology. Silence used to carry anger. Now there was respect in that silence. "Are you meeting with the CEO again today?" he asked, adjusting his glasses. "Yes," I said. "But this time the meeting is not in the office. It's at the Quantilyze headquarters." My words caught his attention. His eyebrows furrowed slightly. "So, in your building?" I looked him in the eye. "Yes, your CEO is coming to our office." This sentence was not just information for him. For the first time in years, the balance of power was not in his words, but in mine. But I carried this power not as a weapon, but as an element of balance. I said it calmly, not proudly. At that moment, his face became serious. There was a short silence. Then came his question. "Your company, how many people does it employ?" 43 people directly. With our project-based contractors, we are a team of 110 people in total, I said. Most of them are engineers with degrees from MIT and Stanford. We also have health ethics consultants. In medical AI, we have to develop ethics, not just technology. He took a sip of his coffee. This information was not unfamiliar to him, but he was just now realizing that this level of organization was under my leadership. He lowered his eyes to the table and looked at his own coffee cup. It was as if he was putting a new picture in his mind. A father trying to redefine his daughter as a business person. "And you're the head of it all." I nodded. "Founder and CEO." I'd said those words hundreds of times before, on panels, at investor meetings, even to new hires. But saying them in front of my father was a different burden than any of them, because for years he had always seen me as a lost potential. Now he was sitting in front of that potential in its real form. "I would like to come to your office one day," he said suddenly. His voice was low, almost timid. I smiled. It was the biggest acceptance that had ever come out of his mouth. "Come," I said, "but this time you will be given a visitor's pass." He didn't laugh, but there was a smile on his face that I hadn't seen in a long time. It was sincere, and that was enough for me. Just then my mother's voice was heard. A door slammed upstairs, and then she called downstairs. "Emily, Thomas called. He wants to bring you in for a meeting. They're going to discuss the new software structure. He wants to hear some of your suggestions." I stopped for a moment. In the past, I wasn't even called to the table. Presentations were made, decisions were made, and I was just notified. But now, my ideas were expected. A silent smile passed through me. This small sentence was the invitation, "You are at this table," that I had been waiting to hear all my life. As I passed through the kitchen, I glanced at my reflection in the mirror. Plain white shirt, hair in a bun, no makeup but a strong stance. That reflection was no longer just a reflection. It was the leading role of a woman who had built her own space, her own story. This morning was different. This morning Emily Carter was not just someone who had come home. This morning Emily Carter woke up not as a guest, but as a partner, a guide, a leader, and this new role gave new meaning even to the walls of the old house. When I entered the company's conference room, I felt neither uneasy nor pretentious. This was the hall at the end of the corridors where, years ago, I had only followed Thomas's footsteps. Back then, I was just a visitor, sitting in the back rows, keeping my head down until the meeting was over, often without getting a chance to speak. But this morning was different. This time I was on the other side of the table. In the conference room, the long table was set with digital screens in the center and glass decanters and notepads in front of it. The company logo was flashing on the screen. Some written notes were left on a whiteboard in the corner of the room. When I walked in, all the seats were taken. Department leaders, project managers, technical experts, everyone was seated. And most importantly, my father was there. When they saw me, there was an unexpected interest on most of their faces. Respect in some eyes, curiosity in others. But none of them were condescending. This surprised me. The equality I had been waiting years for was finally speaking with eyes. Thomas opened the meeting. His sentences were as confident as ever, but this time there was a difference in tone. He was choosing his words more carefully, and he was almost as if he was running each syllable through my approval. "Today, I will present you with some proposals for our new software architecture," he said. "But it will be integrated with the system developed by Quantalize, so Emily's input will be critical here." There was a murmur in the hall. It was something they were not used to. Thomas usually presented his proposals alone, never changing his mind. But now he was leaving the stage to me. He turned to me. There was the slightest tension in his eyes, but for the first time he looked like an equal. I took the floor, made a few small scribbles in the notebook in front of me with my pen, then turned to the screen. "Your data structures are not directly compatible with our system's forecasting algorithms," I said. "But that's not a bad thing. In fact, this diversity can increase the flexibility of the system because different ways of thinking open doors to different solutions, as long as the right match is made." I saw a few nods from the room, and then an engineer took the floor. "The prediction rates of your artificial intelligence engine are really impressive," he said. "But our data sets are very disorganized, sometimes incomplete, sometimes full of discrepancies from different sources. Will this challenge your system?" I smiled. I was expecting this question. "We are trained to work with chaotic data," I said, "because healthcare is already full of unpredictability. Our algorithms are based on making sense of the mess. Chaos is not a shortcoming for us. It is a potential order." These words changed the atmosphere in the hall. Notebooks were opened, heads bowed. Some opened their laptops and started taking notes. Some started preparing questions. My speech was no longer a contribution, but a guidance. CEO Helen Brooks finally took the floor. She was the center of attention at the table. "Emily's approach adds value to our company, not just technically, but strategically," she said. "For many years we have relied on internal resources, but now we have to move to a new phase with external partnerships. Emily, I believe the quantized system will take us a step further. His words were clear, but the real echo was on my father's face. I turned my gaze to him, and he was looking at me quietly, but intently. There was something unfamiliar in his eyes. Not disappointment, not judgment. This time, it was respect. I had never felt it like this before. When the meeting ended, everyone stood up. Some thanked me, some had additional questions. Thomas didn't move for a few seconds. Then he came over to me. "That was really impressive," he said. His voice was soft but sincere. "Working with you was much more valuable than I thought it would be." I turned to her. I looked her in the eye. "Because for years you only saw me as your sister," I said. "But I'm also an entrepreneur. I'm a systems builder. I'm a strategist. We didn't just have to share a last name, we had to share a mindset." He bowed his head. There was not regret in his eyes, but realization. "I realize this too late," he said. "But I don't just want to listen anymore. I really want to understand. I want to learn." Hearing these words was once my dream. Now it felt like a well-deserved development. There was no resentment in me. There was only acceptance. And it was a compassionate voice after years of silence. As I left the meeting room, Thomas opened the door for me. A small gesture, perhaps, but with great symbolic meaning. For years, that door had been opened only for those who were allowed to enter. But now I was passing through that door on my own footsteps, not with a favor, not with an apology, by deserving it, by the right of my wrist. And as the door closed, I realized the other side of that table was no longer just a place, it was where I belonged. At lunch that day, we gathered around a small but influential table, a simple but elaborate table in a special section in the corner of the room. Senior executives, Helen Brooks and me. It no longer made a difference that I was the only woman at the table, because I was no longer just a woman, but an influential actor. The presentations, the graphs, the technical discussions were over, but I knew that the real struggle began now. The real connections, the real decisions, were usually made after the PowerPoint screen was closed. When the food orders were placed, the waiters quietly approached the table and began to place the plates. Helen filled the glass in front of me and then turned to me. Her face was serious as she spoke, but her eyes were warm. "Emily," she said, "working with someone like you is not only a technical benefit. It's also about opening the door to a cultural transformation. Decisions are still made in male-dominated boards. Young women leaders are in the minority. But with this project, you are not only creating technology, but also an exemplary stance." These words affected me deeply. For the first time, a sentence touched not only on my achievements, but also on the symbolic power of my identity and stance. Hearing it from a female CEO gave me the feeling that doors that had been closed for years would now remain open forever. "Thank you, Helen," I said. "This is not just my journey. Every misunderstanding, every ignorance, every not serious enough look that made me who I am today is sitting at this table. I was shaped by them." Thomas and my father were also at the table. They were silent during Helen's words, but that silence was no longer unease, but intimidation. Because they knew this table was no longer the table of the old order. They were still at the table, yes, but the direction of the table had changed. In the second half of the meal, the conversation moved to a more strategic level: project flows, investor relations, merger processes. Just then, Helen turned to me again. This time, her voice was a little lower, but her tone was deeper. "Emily," she said, "we'd like to see you as a board advisor next quarter. It's not just project-based. I want you to have a say in the long-term strategic decisions of the company." The air at the table stilled for a moment. The sentence was not just a job offer, but a declaration of status. The offer was made not to my company, but directly to me. Not my title, but my vision. I looked at Thomas out of the corner of my eye, and his eyebrow twitched slightly. That small gesture was enough to tell me how the balance had shifted over the years. I looked at my father's face. He used to intervene immediately at such a proposal. "Thomas should take on such tasks," he would have said, or he would have made excuses like, "It might wear you out to take on responsibility so soon." But this time he was silent. He didn't turn his head or change his expression. He just listened. Because he knew it was no longer a matter of comparison. It was a matter of acceptance. When the meal was over, everyone thanked each other and dispersed. Short goodbyes were said, but the weight inside me was still on the table. Sitting in that chair, I blinked from the inside at the world I had been forced to look at from the outside for years. After dinner, I wanted to be alone. I went out into the garden. I turned off the small walkway at the back of the house and went out onto the lawn. I sat on the old ottoman where I used to sit and read on summer evenings. That ottoman had been worn by the wind over time. The paint faded, but it was still there. Just like some of the feelings inside me, worn out, but still there. A few minutes later, I heard footsteps behind me. It was my mother. She was holding a brown cardboard folder. She walked over and stood next to me. "I thought about it last night," he said. "In one of the old boxes in your room, I found the art booklets you had printed years ago, black and white drawings, some with notes and colored pencils. It all started so early that we only tried to stop you." I looked at her. There was acceptance mixed with regret in her eyes. That tired expression was just a reflection of the emotions a mother suppresses for years. "You tried to do the right thing," I said slowly. "But the right thing is not always planned. Sometimes the best path is the one you take on your own, even in the dark." He nodded. He let out a long breath. "That's okay," he said. "Still, just realizing that is a step. Your path was very different from ours, but we thought it was wrong before it was walked." Then he took something out of his pocket. A small, old, leather-bound organizer. The pages were yellowed, the edges frayed. "Your father asked me to give this to you. He had notes about the company in it. Ideas, reasons for some past decisions. He said you could work on it together if you want. Maybe this will be a new beginning." I picked up the agenda. It was a feeling I hadn't expected. Not an order, but advice. Not pressure, but suggestion. This was the first time that a real offer of cooperation had been extended to me by my family. In that moment, I thought, everything was still complicated. I hadn't fully forgiven, but maybe I should have taken steps not to forgive, but to rebuild. I looked up at my mother before opening the agenda. "This is more than just notes," I said. "This is a silent alliance." My mother smiled. This time the wrinkles at the corners of her eyes held hope, not fatigue. And in that moment I understood. No matter what battles we had fought in the past, we still had a chance to shape the future together. When I picked up the agenda, it was not just the pages of an old notebook that passed through my fingers. There were years of accumulation, unwritten letters, unspoken sentences, unspoken approvals. I opened it, leaning my back against the pillow on the bed. The pages were yellowed, but each one was neat. The lines were neat. The date sequences meticulously followed. Inside were investor profiles of the company, potential merger opportunities, analysis notes, small footnotes explaining why certain decisions had been made. On some pages there was only one name. But underneath those names, there were strategic details tucked between the lines. Each word showed how my father thought, how he moved, and what was important to him throughout his business life. This agenda was a playbook, but it was more than that. It was a sacred notebook to him, and now it had been given to me. As someone who had sat side by side with him for years but had never been allowed close to his mind, now, for the first time, the door to his world of thought was open to me. What was interesting was that what I felt was not just pride, it was a kind of fulfillment. I was now accepted for who I was, not just for my achievements. I had inherited not a dream that had been written off, but a legacy whose direction had changed. The next morning, it was not yet 8 o'clock. I was checking the guest list for our office when I saw his name, Thomas Carter. He had not announced his arrival. Perhaps for the first time, he wanted to be caught off guard. He needed a simple reality, not a script, to see the truth. When he walked through the entrance door, his eyes immediately fell on the logo on the wall. Quantalize, redefining healthcare through intelligence. A moving panel of data swirled beneath the text. Real-time AI forecasts, patient tracking, model analysis. It was all a functional presentation, not just aesthetic. Our office interior design was minimal yet sophisticated. The walls were white, the lights were natural, the desks were light-colored. But most importantly, there was a mountain of energy. I could see it in his eyes. Thomas hadn't expected this. When we got into the elevator, there was a silence I didn't recognize. Thomas liked to talk, especially in areas where he felt he had the upper hand. But this time, he was only looking at the walls, the glass partitions, the employees. His eyes wandered, but his tongue was silent. It was the first time he had met silent admiration. We landed on the 3rd floor and went into our meeting room, where Clara, my team leader, was explaining the new project flow on the interactive whiteboard. Thomas sat in a corner, but he couldn't take his attention away from the presentation. Clara's professional language, the cohesion of the team, the technological integration. Each of these were rare in Thomas's world. As the presentation continued, he leaned slightly toward me and whispered, "How do you lead these people? Most of them are older than you, but they listen to you word for word, without asking a single question." His face was serious. This question was not only curiosity, but also a confession. "I don't just give orders," I said. "I tell, I reassure, I grow by involving everyone, by sharing the decision-making power." This was a new concept for him. Thomas had grown up with authority. His leadership was about making decisions and implementing them. Mine was built on empathy, vision, sharing. When the presentation was over, Thomas got up and turned to Clara. "You have set up a very well-organized structure," he said. Clara smiled, but turned her gaze to me and replied, "Actually, the structure was always there. Emily just made us realize it. She works as a clarifier, not as a leader." These words brought a thoughtful expression to Thomas's face. When his eyes turned from Clara to me, there was no more jealousy or defense. There was only genuine appreciation. "Working with you, it's not a competition," he said. "It's a privilege." This sentence took me back to high school. I remembered the day he called me empty work, when I won 2nd prize in the science fair. His voice had broken in my eyes that day. Now, million-dollar projects were being discussed over those empty jobs. The resentment at that time has now turned into a sweet smile. When the meeting was over, I went up to the terrace of the office. While quietly watching the city, my mind was still on that old notebook. There were notebooks in my life that would not close. Some of those notebooks were filled with injustice, some with ignorance. But now, it seemed possible not to open a new notebook, but to continue the old one with the right hand. As I left the office that day, Thomas turned to me and said, "I've had my father's diary for years, but it should have always been yours because this company, this vision, it's beyond his imagination, and you made it happen." For years, there were books between us that were silent, that hadn't been closed. Now maybe those books are still not closed. But they had been handed over to me. I didn't erase the pages. I opened them to add new ones. In the past, I had a suppressed voice. Now that voice echoed in every room of the office, in every corner of the meetings, and no one dared to silence it anymore. It was the last day of the week. It was a little after 7. I picked up my coffee, opened the window curtain. The house was quiet. During the 5 days I spent in that familiar room, every morning a new burden had fallen off my back. Every night another wound had scabbed over. I looked around the room for the last time. The old poster on the wall, the bookcase with my childhood notebooks, even the drawing table from my high school years still standing in the corner. They were all witnesses of an era. But it wasn't mine anymore. I was still the same Emily, but this house could no longer fit me inside. A few hours later, we had our final meeting with CEO Helen Brooks at Quantalize's headquarters. It was the culmination of 5 days of transformation. Everything was now official. The partnership would be announced, the internal launch would take place, the new collaboration would take shape before it leaked outside the media. The girl who for years had been on the outside looking in, not allowed in, was now the founder of the table. Helen greeted me standing as I entered the meeting room. Her smile was not just professional courtesy, it was genuine admiration. "Everyone in the office has been talking about your name for the last 10 days, she said. "It's not often an outsider CEO is so quickly trusted, but your vision is not just technical, it makes people question themselves." I just nodded my head for a while. That sentence meant more to me than pages of praise, because this was not just business success. It was a refutation of all the adjectives I had been called for years: too emotional, too independent, too sensitive. In a world where women leaders had to suppress their emotions, where kindness was considered a weakness and understanding a weakness, I had become a leader with all these qualities. And I was accepted. Helen turned to me as she closed the presentation file. "For today's launch, we would like you to say a few words, not just the technical details, but the human side of this process. Because this story is not just Quantalize's story, it's your story too." I smiled. "With pleasure." When I left the building after the meeting, Thomas was waiting for me at the entrance. He was wearing a casual jacket and holding a yellow gift bag. His eyes were tired but bright. He came up to me, handed me the package. "This is for you," he said, "to see the past from another perspective." I opened the package. Inside was an old framed photograph. It was from our childhood. I'm buried in my sketchbook, completely closed off from the world. Thomas is next to me, looking at me. An expression captured in that moment, a look of both curiosity and distance. Under the frame, he had written this sentence: "I didn't understand then. Now I see." At that moment, my eyes filled with tears. But this time I didn't cry, because my emotions were no longer uncontrolled overflows, but evidence of a strong connection. Everyone who had called me too emotional in the past failed to understand something. Emotion does not diminish success. On the contrary, it adds soul to it. What for years had been a shortcoming was now my greatest strength. Thomas took a step back. "I want to invite you to our first team meeting tomorrow," he said. "Not just to get support, to learn." It was one of those moments when years of resistance unraveled. I hadn't tried for years to teach him anything. I had just made my way, and now that way had attracted his attention. In the evening, I was surprised once again with a message from my father. "I just want to be with you tonight. Shall we have dinner together?" It was a simple, short, but sincere invitation. I accepted. When I arrived at the restaurant, it was the first time I saw him without a suit. He was relaxed. Maybe for the first time, he really was. "Emily," he said at the beginning of the meal, "in the past I didn't even look to see you. I always looked through other people's eyes, through the values of the company, the expectations of society, but I never tried to understand you through your eyes." His words gave me chills. It was the summary of what I had been waiting for all these years, and now it sounded exactly as it should, belated but sincere. I bowed my head, turned my eyes to the candlelight on the table and didn't want to speak, because sometimes silence is the most elegant form of forgiveness. At the end of the meal, my father interjected again. "You are not just a successful person," he said. "You are a leader of character. And I can say that now, belatedly." For me, that sentence was above awards, above contracts, above partnerships. My father was finally recognizing me for who I was, not just for my results. At that moment, a burden that had been like a stone inside me for a long time seemed to crumble and fall to the ground. We left the restaurant together. The air was cool, there was a slight breeze, but I was warm inside. I was walking with my father for the first time in years, but most importantly, I was walking side by side with him for the first time. In the past, I was always one step behind, a silent shadow, waiting for approval, being compared. Now our steps were in the same rhythm. In his eyes, I was no longer a little girl, but a traveling companion. As we crossed the sidewalk, I looked at us reflected in the window, two adults walking side by side. Both of them had respect in their gaze and trust in their hearts. That night I made peace not only with my family but also with my past. The whole picture was now clear, and in this picture I was standing in the center. It was dark when I got home, but the lights inside were warm. When the door opened, my mother was there. She was waiting quietly. She was holding a small black box, an elegant box covered in velvet, bearing the traces of time. Her face was tired, but there was a peaceful determination in her eyes. She looked at me, smiled. He held it out slowly. "We planned to give you this years ago," he said. His voice was soft. "But the right time never came. Maybe what we were always waiting for was for you to come back our way. But you made your own path." I picked up the box with both hands. It weighed more than I thought it would. When I opened it, a thin necklace came out, a gold ring with a tiny but brilliant emerald in the center, elegant and simple. But what really caught my attention were the two words engraved in the center, "Your way." At that moment, my throat tightened. For many years, whenever I tried to choose my own path, I was met with silence or guidance. These two words were not just a gift, but a deep acceptance. It contained years of regret, apology, and finally respect. Nothing could be said anymore, because sometimes a gift is louder than a confession. "Thank you," I said, taking a deep breath so my voice wouldn't shake. Wearing this is not just a piece of jewelry. It's a symbol of keeping the promise I made to myself. My mother nodded. Her eyes welled up, but she didn't cry. Perhaps for the first time in this house, emotions were not suppressed, but lived as they were. That evening there was a small celebration at home. This time, not just for Thomas's new position. There was no longer a single star in this house. Two different lights shining in two different ways, but united at the same table. The living room was simple but elaborate. A candlelit table, name cards left on the rim of glasses, the smell of cinnamon rolls coming from the kitchen. This was an evening to celebrate transformation, not achievement. My father stood up. Everyone fell silent. In the old days, Thomas's name would have been called first, but this time he paused, his eyes fixed on me. "Of course we are celebrating our son's new position in the company," he said. "But tonight, there's more." His voice had a different timbre than usual. It wasn't high, it wasn't pretentious. But this time it was sincere. It was real. "Emily," he continued, "we may not have accompanied you on your journey. We even turned our backs on you most of the time. But after seeing where you are today, we realize how much courage it took to walk that path. You walked silently, you resisted, you did not give up. And now, we give you a standing ovation." There was a moment of silence. There was everything in that silence. Unspoken apologies, belated appreciation, the weight of years of silence. Then Thomas stood up. He raised his glass slightly. This time there was no jealousy in his eyes, no race. Only the genuine admiration of a brother for his sister shone in them. "Emily," he said, "you have been an example not only to me, but to this family. Maybe after you, we will be able to make our own decisions more freely. Maybe we will question more. We will be less afraid. You taught us not only success, but also courage." Then there was applause. It was big. It was loud, but it was sincere, long and whole. And at that moment I closed my eyes because another voice was echoing inside me. Sentences that had been suppressed, unheard, belittled for years. "You can't get anywhere with art. The real career is corporate success. We want what's best for you." These words had covered me like a curtain for years. Every time I achieved something, sentences starting with "but" followed. But tonight, those words were replaced by a round of applause, and more importantly, the silence behind that applause was much stronger. Because that silence was an expression of respect that no longer needed to be spoken. Everyone understood. Everyone accepted it. And that was the deepest victory. At the end of the night, I was in my room. I didn't turn off the lights. I stood in front of the mirror and put the necklace from the box around my neck. The shiny emerald was right above my heart. I took a long look in the mirror, no triumphant expression on my face, no arrogance, no rebellion, just a deep peace, a balance I had finally found with myself, my past, and my family. Sometimes the greatest achievement is not to enter a room to applause, but to leave it in silence but with respect. And tonight, I was accepted in that silence. This was no longer a success story. This was a woman reclaiming her story. Chapter 15. Beginning, not closing. Before my flight back to Boston, I stepped out into the backyard of the house in the early morning light. The dew-drenched grass cooled my bare feet, and the sky was cloudless. Everything was quiet. Only the melody of the birds, unprepared for the new day, could be heard. I sat on the sofa with a steaming cup of tea in my hand. I had sat in this garden years ago. Back then I used to come here to escape from everything, to take a breath after every argument I didn't understand. Then I wanted to be alone. Now I didn't need to be alone, because there was no longer silence inside me, but inner peace. My mind drifted back into the past. My child self. That girl who was trying to meet her family's expectations, feeling incomplete at every step. The me who hid her sketchbooks under her pillow against those who told her to get serious when she wanted to be a painter. The me who grew up in the shadow of my family, who pouted for days when I changed my major at university. But even as I was growing in that shadow, my roots were deeply rooted in the soil. While my branches were searching for direction, I learned to look for my own sun, because it was never about embarrassing others or saying, "Look who I have become." It was always about this, walking for myself, not in their shadow, but in my own light. The door opened slightly, then a familiar footstep. My father came out in his dressing gown, a plain cream-colored coffee mug in his hand. He approached me quietly. He sat down. He didn't say anything. He took a few sips of his coffee. We shared only silence. Then he spoke, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "You're leaving, aren't you?" I nodded. "For now?" A bird song accompanied us. The wind gently moved the branches of the tree. Then my father took a deep breath. "For years we have been waiting for you, a clear, solid, defined path. When you didn't walk that path, we thought yours was disappointment. But you went far beyond those expectations. You drew your own compass. And it's all the more precious because you were able to do it not independently of us, but without us." Something inside me unraveled. A wound, maybe unrecognized but stuck somewhere, was gently bandaged with that sentence. "Thank you," I said. "For years I thought I walked alone, but when I finally looked back, maybe it was that lonely walk that made me who I am." "You walked alone, yes," my father said. "But now we are learning to walk too. Not your way, maybe, but our own way, with your courage." This time my mother appeared at the door, then Thomas. They were in their dressing gowns, their faces sleepy, but also a warm intimacy. They came to us in silence. Thomas said goodbye to me with a big hug. When he put his head on my shoulder, the old rivalry was replaced by a brother, a real bond. "Please keep us posted often," he said. "This time my news won't come from the newspaper," I smiled. "I'll tell you directly." Mom took my hand. "Your room will be waiting for you when you get home, but it's no longer just the room of your past. It's the room of your achievements." The goodbyes were short, because a prolonged goodbye would unnecessarily expose emotions, and we were no longer bound by words, but by feelings. When I boarded the plane, I sat by the window and looked out as the sound of the engine filled my ears. The house got smaller, then the city, then it all disappeared, but something grew inside me, to be seen, to be truly heard. And finally, a life written in my own footsteps. I once thought I always had some self-worth to prove, but now I knew. Worth is not defined from the outside. It is lived from the inside. I no longer had to prove who I was, because I already existed. I opened my laptop for the last few lines. For the first time, I was going to close this video by addressing not only the audience, but also myself. I'm Emily Carter. For years, I walked in silence. I've been ignored. I've been belittled. I've been tried to get out of the way. But I never lost faith in myself. Today, I rewrote my life. I trusted my vision, not their approval. And you know what? The loudest applause sometimes comes when no one can hear it. The first step in the silence of the night, the first idea you fought for, in that decision that you couldn't explain to anyone. That's where that inner applause resounds. What about you? Have you ever had to make your own way? Have you ever made yourself exist despite those who don't see you? Tell me in the comments. And if this story has sparked something in you, please like and subscribe, because on this channel, I will continue to tell the stories of those who make their own path. This is not closure. This is just a new beginning.